Hello, I'm Generation 3DX, a DAZ studio artist. Hopefully by now you've watched all my foundation series on beautiful art in DAZ. If you haven't, then check out this link here on the series. I'll now be looking at some more advanced concepts that will allow you to expand your repertoire of tools with DAZ to help create more realistic scenes. The first tool I'll be looking at is dForce and simulation. By now you've probably seen the word dForce floating around in the various product descriptions in the marketplace, specifically relating to hair and clothing products. So what is it? dForce is a dynamic simulation engine that allows for realistic movement and behavior of soft and flexible materials like fabric and hair under gravity, wind and collision forces. When used correctly, hair and clothing will look much more real and lifelike as they respond to gravity and wind draping over your figures by simulating the physics of material properties under an exerted force. That sounds all very technical. Let's have a look at dForce in a real scene so we can actually understand it and see how it can enhance the realism of your scenes. Today we're joined by Joni and her twin sister Isla, and we're going to be doing a demo with those two by draping them in a specific clothing product which will respond very well to dForce. So I've already posed Joni and Isla in the pose that I want. The clothing I'm going to use is not the clothing I'm showing now. The clothing I'm showing you now is just so we don't get arrested by the YouTube police. I'm actually going to load in the actual garments that we're going to use for demonstrating dForce. Okay, so I've now clothed them in the Akasha outfit, which is by Rhiannon, with a surface edition done by Valkyrie. Okay, I'll link these products into the description, so if you want to play with them, I think it's a beautiful set and it's particularly good for demoing dForce. Now the first thing we see when we actually have the clothing loaded is that it's a mess. Okay, there's something going on here with the sleeves, and these sleeves look like they should be draping down through gravity, and particularly you can see Joni's arm around her there. The sleeve is a total disaster. Okay, so this product you've got to use dForce with it for it to make any sense. Okay, so how do we actually use the dForce component so that we can actually get this garment to drape correctly over these two figures? So the first thing we'll look at is if we just select the surface here, for instance the sleeve. Now if you go to surfaces and you scroll down, you'll see here you've got visible in simulation, but then you've also got all these different properties. Okay, these are like stiffness, shear, stretch, bend, buckling and so forth. Normally you don't need to mess with any of these because the artist who's created the garment has set these in the way that he or she thinks they should best function. And typically fabrics are, unless, I mean I'm no expert on this, but generally fabrics behave in a fairly consistent way. So generally you'll find that these settings are mostly on the default settings anyway. Okay, you can also find in the parameters tab, if you scroll down, we will see here visible in simulation. Okay, so this needs to be, make sure that's set to on. Okay, and if it's on, then it means it's going to participate in the simulation. What is the simulation? A simulation, you can access this from the simulation tab. If you don't have your simulation tab settings, go to panes, tabs, and you can select simulation on there. So you turn the simulation settings tab on and then it will appear as a selection here. Okay, so what we have is a simulation. What it does, it simulates the physics, and it's going to use your graphics card, or your NVIDIA graphics card is going to be used to run a time-based simulation of that fabric operating under gravity, and possibly also wind as well. Okay, so let's look at the fact that we've got gravity set to 1, Air resistance, we set that, we leave that at default of 0.15, and we have this start bones from Memorize Pose, which I'll also talk about in a minute. But before we actually get into all the kind of technicalities of what's going on, let's just actually see this in action. Okay, so we can do this by running the simulate button. Okay, so with the default settings on, and make sure this is turned off for the moment. Okay, because I'm going to cover this shortly. Start bones from Memorize Pose, turn that off, and then we run simulate. So we first get a pop-up which shows the initialization of the fabric, and then immediately we go into the actual simulation itself, and we can see the fabric is responding to gravity really quite nicely, and is draping over the arms and to some extent the legs, and falling under gravity. Very good. So we'll go over to iRay Preview now, and that looks really rather good, doesn't it? So that fabric is looking much more realistic. Well, it's looking usable. It wasn't usable before, really, but we see there's already got a problem here. That is all cutting into Isla's body. The reason for that is because in the initial pose of Joni's arm around Isla, the sleeve was already kind of colliding with Isla's body. Okay, and so it would get stuck to it, and the rule is that if a d-force fabric is in a simulation, if it comes into contact with a surface, it will then try to work around that surface. If it's stuck inside that surface, then it won't move from there. It'll hold its position. So this is something we definitely don't want. How do we actually get around this problem? Well, we have to get around the problem by using this thing called start bones from Memorize Pose. And what does that mean? It means that we're going to memorize a pose which is different to the final pose, and we're going to start Joni, for instance. We're going to start her arm. Go to top view. We're going to start her arm away from the body. Okay, we clear that simulation. We want that fabric to be clear of any other objects when we start the simulation, so that it can actually fall under gravity without being disturbed. Okay, so to do that, let me just undo that movement there, because we want to ensure that we first preserve the final pose that we want. And in this case, we're going to be moving Joni, just Joni. We're not going to be moving Isla. So we select Joni, and then we do File, Save As, Pose Preset, and it should just be Joni Temp. Save everything as it is. You don't need to change or turn off anything, because we want to preserve the full translation, rotation, everything in that. So we just save that as defaults. So we've saved out our final pose. Now we can actually move Joni into that first position. Move that out of the way. Just check that in the perspective view that fabric is well clear. Yes, so that fabric is clear of any other interruptions. One could argue that Isla's fabric here is interfering somewhat here, but we'll keep it simple for now, because I don't want to move Isla as well as Joni for this purpose of this demo. That fabric was actually working quite well, and you didn't really notice it was a problem. It was only Joni's sleeve that was a real problem there. Right, so what we're going to do now, with that different pose saved, Joni selected, we go to Edit, Figure, Memorize Figure Pose. It's going to make a snapshot of that pose. Okay, if I just move her around now, just to demo this, but try to just pretend that we've got put her back on the shoulder, just doesn't really matter what we're doing there. If I now go back to if I go to restore, this is not part of your workflow for simulation, because simulation is going to do this for you, but this is just to demonstrate that it's now restored the figure pose to the Memorize. This basically also explains the difference between 0 and restore. Restore will restore it to a memorized pose if you have saved a memorized pose. 0 will put it back to a T pose. Okay, we certainly don't want that. But in the absence of a memorized pose, restore will also go to the T-pose. Okay, so it'll only do your it'll only actually restore it to that. It'll only restore it to your actual memorized pose if you've actually saved one by doing that memorize thing. Okay, so again, you can just check that figure, restore figure pose. Okay, good. So let's actually reload. Now that we've got the initial pose that we want to go back to the final pose. Okay, because that's the actual pose that we need for the actual final render. Okay, and we do that by going to our pose presets, and there it is there, Joni Temp. So we click on that to reload our final pose. Okay, just double check that's the scene that we want, and we are now ready to run the simulation, but with this new setting, start bones from memorized pose. Okay, so let's go ahead. Actually, let me go to the perspective view so you can see this more clearly, what's going to happen. All right, so we're ready to do the simulation now, so we'll click that now. So now you can see it's moved her arm back. Okay, and the fabric is falling under gravity, but her arm is moving toward the final pose from the initial memorized pose. And that way now this fabric can fall and get itself into position before it starts to come into contact with Isla's body. I also noticed that Isla's arm is moving, which is interesting. I must have had her on I must have saved her as a memorized pose earlier. I think in fact I did that. I'm pretty sure I did that. So we'll just watch the simulation when it's run through its course, and we'll just speed this up. Alright, so she's stopped moving now. She's now into the final pose, and now it's just doing a finishing stabilization of that fabric. Now you noticed it took a lot longer this time. When we first ran the simulation without moving and posing around or anything, but now without doing a memorized pose, it did it in about 20 seconds. It's taken almost 4 minutes to do this, which is to be expected because it's moving. When it's moving the character, it's also interfering. It's messing with the physics as it's doing. Anyway, so that's done. Let's have a look. Looking good. Yeah, that's really nice. See, that's all. Not that we actually see that in the final camera, but if you wanted to get a different angle, I guess, you know, it's draping around her buttockle region quite nicely, and this arm here is finally fixed. That's properly fixed. You see, it's not got caught up in her body in any way. It's draping very nicely around in that way. Okay, we just go to that final camera pose. Well, we actually don't really see that sleeve anyway. So after all that work that we did, it didn't. Now I did actually earlier memorize Isla. I remember now. I earlier memorized Isla's pose so that this arm came out, and her arm gradually moved in during the simulation. This explains why we've got a very nice. Let's actually just look at iRay preview here. Yep, so we've actually, I mean, I'm very pleased with that result. That is definitely a result I will publish because the fabrics are working very, very nicely. Here's the final render, by the way, of this. You can see this in full 4K render. You can see that the fabrics are very nicely draping around the arms, legs and body and so forth of the two girls. And it's a really nice. It's got a really nice material properties and surfacing that was done by Valkyrie, who did the materials pack in addition as an add-on for this Akasa garment. Okay, so that is the basics of simulation and memorizing poses to fix any issues that might occur at the beginning of that simulation, and that relates to clothing. Now, clothing in general responds very, very well to dForce, but now let's also talk about hair. Okay, I have personally had not as much success in getting dForce to work with hair, and I will demonstrate this by actually looking at we'll look at this particular hair product that we have for both Joni and Isla, and it's called Wild Short Hair. It's by Sagittarius A. It's a particularly nice product that I found works very well for just generally looking realistic. Now, in order to do this pose, I actually did work on making some adjustments to the shaping dials because you see Isla's head here is slightly inclined. Okay, and that meant that I needed to do some adjustments to the left and right characteristics of this hair product. If we were to, and by the way, if you're probably wondering why the hair didn't move during the simulation, let's talk about that. You can see if I go to parameters, wild short hair, I actually turned off visible in simulation because I didn't want it interfering with the simulation, because we were just simulating the clothing. Okay, so I'd had that turned off. Okay, so what we'll do now is I'm just going to reset this simulation, and so what we're going to do is for the clothing, because I want to demonstrate the hair now, I'm going to just turn that off so it doesn't show, so it's not visible in simulation. We'll do the same for Joni's set, and visible in simulation is turned off. So if I was to run the simulation now, nothing will happen because everything is turned off. No objects to simulate. Okay, so let's turn on the hair product, Isla's hair. We'll enable that now. Visible in simulation on. Okay, and we'll do start bones from memorize pose. We'll just turn that off. Okay, and also I'm going to reset. I'm going to reset the shaping dials, with the exception of. So we just clear these bends, fronts, lefts, and rights, but we don't want to change the style. We just want to change the movement dials. Now you could say, well, why didn't you just do 0 reset shapes? Because I wanted to keep the length of the hair, the styling. I wanted to keep this one as well, behind ear right. So we've got long, and yeah, there's those two, and these styles here. Okay, now we can see here, if we just switch to another camera view, and we'll just zoom in a bit here. So we can see that this, if we actually go to IRA preview, so we can see that this hair is not realistic right now, because it should drape down this way because her head is inclined, and this hair should come over here. I say now, previously I did this by doing the shaping dials left and right and so forth. It's quite picky, it's quite tedious work to do that for every single pose that you're working on. Let's see if we can actually get dForce to actually do a realistic job here. I actually have never used it before on this product, so this is very much an experiment, but let's see what happens. So what we'll do is we'll ensure again that we select the hair, and we can either go into surfaces and check it there. Visible in simulation, it's turned on. It's also there in the parameters tab under wild short hair. Visible in simulation on. Okay, so start bones from memorize pose, just leave that turned off, because we just have a head in that position, and we'll just let the hair drape and see what happens. All right, let's just go in the lap of the gods here and see how this works. So we click the simulate, and now it's running wild short hair. It's doing a material analysis of all these springs and collisions of the hair, and now it's going to run the simulation. You usually find that hair products are very slow compared to clothing when they're running the simulation, because there's just so much more going on. Hair is much more complicated than clothing. Let's just run this simulation and we'll see what happens. Alright, we can see that very little is happening here, and I say this is a general experience I get with hair and dForce, and that they either just go really floppy or nothing seems to happen. So let's try to debug this. Alright, okay, so despite messing around with quite a lot of settings here, I wasn't able to get this hair to move at all, to be honest. So this is a lesson, a salutary lesson really, in the fact that in my experience, I as mentioned earlier, I just actually work, when I'm working with hair, I work with the shaping dials in order to get the hair in the position that I want, which is not ideal, but I say I've had very little success in getting, even with changing these various different settings, even with using some ChatGPT help and so forth to try to straighten out what's going on, even increasing gravity, can't get the hair to move. Anyway, right, so we won't get any. You're welcome to experiment with the hair, and if you have any suggestions about specific hair that works well, or what settings work well with hair, just leave those in the comments. Let's talk about the last thing I want to mention, which is if we have a fabric which isn't inherently dForce, we can actually add dForce to that fabric. Okay, so to demonstrate this, I'll load in a separate scene and we'll see what's going on. Okay, so here is a scene. We've got a figure, Kayla in this case. She's kind of lying on the bed in the Japanese capsule hotel, which actually was featured in the final demo video of my introductory series. So what the idea is, I want to put a sheet on top of her and have that sheet drape over her. Okay, now this scene didn't come with that sheet, but what we can do is we can create a sheet, which is by creating a primitive, which in this case is just a plane, and here's just one. I just set it up with the dimensions and so on a minute ago. If you're wondering how to do such a thing, that's create new primitive, and you do a plane, and then you do these various settings here which you can play around with to get the sheet in the particular size and in orientation that you need. So this plane obviously is a primitive, it doesn't come with dForce, but we can add dForce to it. Okay, now the menu that I use is I switch on to plane and I go to edit, geometry, and here we've got add dForce modifier. Okay, select dynamic surface. So now if we look on the surfaces tab of the plane, we have visible in simulation on, and we have the various different dForce parameters that relate to that sheet. Okay, now I just leave the default ones here. The default usually works well, and one thing I do quickly want to check is before I run the simulation, I don't want to have her hair running, because the hair will just slow it down terribly. Just double check that. Right, so the hair is set to off. Okay, so let's run that simulation and see what happens. So we can see immediately the sheet is falling under gravity. We did very little work there. We just added the dForce modifier to a primitive, and hey presto, it's created really not a bad looking realistic ghost sheet, if you want to call it that. If we go to dForce, go to iRay preview, I mean, we're probably still going to do some work on this, probably on the surface settings, just to make it look a bit more realistic. But you can see it's actually done. It's done exactly what we thought it should do. We add the dForce modifier to the sheet, and the sheet now acts with physics, as if it's just a kind of a standard fabric. So that is how you can apply dForce to a non-dForce object. Okay, so again, you select the object, you select this context menu here, edit, geometry, edit geometry, and add dForce modifier, dynamic surface. Boom, that's it. Right, okay, I think that's really all I've got to say on dForce at this time. I hope this video has demonstrated how you can use dForce to create realistic physics-based simulation of fabrics draping under gravity and so forth, and possibly hair if you can get very good at that, in order to create more realistic scenes. If you found the video useful, please like and subscribe. You can learn more about my art by following me at Generation 3DX on DeviantArt, and I'll see you in the next video.